Long after the city lights dimmed and the restless noise of New York softened into a distant hum, there existed a kind of power that did not announce itself. It moved quietly, almost invisibly, through narrow Brooklyn streets and behind the closed doors of modest-looking buildings. This power did not rely on headlines or spectacle. It did not crave fear from the public or admiration from the press. It preferred silence. And at the center of that silence sat a man named Joe Profaci, a figure whose influence shaped decades of organized crime while his name remained largely unknown beyond those who needed to know it. In the early 1960s, when many gangsters sought attention through flamboyant displays of wealth or public violence, Profaci was already an aging man, content to let others underestimate him. He ruled not through charisma or intimidation alone, but through structure, patience, and an almost old-world sense of order. His power did not erupt suddenly, it accumulated slowly, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river, unseen but impossible to ignore once disturbed. This was a man who understood that longevity mattered more than legend, that survival was the greatest victory in a world where most stories ended abruptly. To understand Joe Profaci, one must first imagine New York not as the loud, chaotic metropolis it would later become, but as a collection of neighborhoods bound together by habit, tradition, and unspoken rules. In Brooklyn, the air carried the mixed scents of bread bakeries, fresh coffee, and salt drifting inland from the harbor. Men gathered on stoops in the evening, speaking in low voices, watching passers-by without appearing to watch at all. It was in this environment that Profaci thrived. He blended in seamlessly, presenting himself as a businessman, a family man, a devout Catholic. Nothing about him invited suspicion from the casual observer, and that was precisely the point. While other mob figures cultivated fear as a currency, Profaci cultivated obligation. His authority rested on loyalty reinforced by tradition, on debts that were rarely written down but never forgotten. He did not need to raise his voice. A quiet word, delivered at the right moment, carried far more weight. Those who worked under him understood that his calm demeanor masked an unyielding expectation of obedience. Order was everything. Chaos was weakness. And Profaci despised weakness, especially when it threatened the stability he had spent a lifetime building. There is something almost paradoxical about a crime boss whose greatest weapon was restraint. In an underworld defined by impulsive violence and shifting alliances, Profaci's careful approach seemed, at times, outdated. Yet it was precisely this restraint that allowed him to endure. He watched others rise quickly and fall just as fast, consumed by ambition or undone by their own need for recognition. Profaci, by contrast, remained in the background, letting time work in his favor. Every year he survived added to his authority. Every conflict he avoided preserved his position. As the 1960s approached, the world around Profaci was changing. A younger generation of criminals was emerging, less patient, less respectful of tradition, more willing to challenge established hierarchies. These men had grown up in America, not Sicily. They spoke the language of opportunity rather than obligation. To them, Profaci's insistence on tribute and discipline felt stifling, even exploitative. But to Profaci, these demands were the foundation of order. Without them, everything unraveled. At night, when the city slowed and conversations grew quieter, Profaci's world came into sharper focus. Meetings were held in subdued rooms where the lighting was low and the voices were lower still. Decisions were made deliberately, without drama. A nod, a pause, a carefully chosen phrase could determine the future of a business, a neighborhood, even a life. There were no grand speeches, no theatrical gestures. Power, in Profaci's hands, was something to be handled gently, like a fragile object that could shatter if dropped. This quiet dominance extended beyond crime into the rhythms of everyday life. Profaci attended church regularly, contributing generously, reinforcing his image as a respectable pillar of the community. He understood the value of appearances, not as a disguise, but as a form of insulation. The more ordinary he seemed, the less likely anyone was to look too closely. His legitimacy was not just a cover, it was a strategy. In a city where law enforcement often focused on the loudest offenders, Profaci's silence became a shield. Yet beneath this calm exterior, tension was always present, like a faint vibration just below the surface. Maintaining control without overt force required constant vigilance. Loyalty had to be nurtured, monitored, sometimes tested. Profaci trusted tradition, but he was not naive. He knew that power, once challenged, rarely returned easily. The shadows he ruled from were comfortable, but they were not entirely safe. Every quiet empire carries within it the seeds of unrest. As listeners drift deeper into this story, it becomes clear that Joe Profaci's life was not defined by dramatic moments, but by long stretches of calculated stillness. His reign was not a series of explosive events, but a slow, steady assertion of authority that reshaped New York's criminal landscape without ever drawing attention to itself. This was a man who believed that the strongest presence was the one least felt, that true control did not need to be seen to be effective. And yet, even the most carefully constructed silence can be broken. As the years passed and the world around him evolved, the question lingered quietly in the background: how long could a man built on tradition withstand a future driven by impatience? The answer, like Profaci himself, would emerge slowly, unfolding over time, revealing that even shadows are shaped by the light they avoid. Long before Joe Profaci became a quiet force in the neighborhoods of Brooklyn, before his name carried weight in whispered conversations, his story began far from the streets of New York. It began in Villabate, a small town in Sicily where life moved slowly and traditions shaped every aspect of daily existence. The land there was dry and unforgiving, yet deeply familiar to those who worked it. Families lived close together, bound not only by blood but by an unspoken understanding of loyalty, respect, and survival. In this environment, young Giuseppe Profaci learned early that stability was precious and that authority, once earned, was rarely questioned. Sicily at the turn of the 20th century was a place defined by contrasts. On the surface, it appeared timeless, almost untouched by the rapid changes sweeping through other parts of Europe. Beneath that surface, however, poverty pressed heavily on ordinary people. Opportunities were limited, and the future often seemed predetermined. For many families, the idea of leaving was not an adventure but a necessity. America, distant and imagined, became a symbol of possibility, a place where effort might finally be rewarded and where a man could redefine his fate. When Giuseppe Profaci left Sicily, he carried more than a suitcase. He brought with him the values of his homeland, respect for hierarchy, an instinct for caution, and a deep belief in the importance of family and reputation. These were not lessons learned in classrooms but absorbed through observation, through watching how men conducted themselves and how disputes were settled quietly, without drawing unnecessary attention. In Villabate, survival depended on knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. This instinct would later serve Profaci well in a very different world. The journey to America was long and uncertain. The crossing itself was crowded and uncomfortable, filled with others who shared similar hopes and fears. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, reinforcing the sense that there was no turning back. For Giuseppe, this voyage marked the first major transition of his life, a movement away from familiar rhythms toward an unknown future. By the time the ship approached New York Harbor, exhaustion mixed with anticipation. The skyline, still modest by later standards, rose like a promise on the horizon. Ellis Island was overwhelming. The air buzzed with voices speaking dozens of languages, all layered with anxiety and hope. Officials moved briskly, processing human lives with mechanical efficiency. Giuseppe passed through this system quietly, drawing little attention, just another young immigrant among thousands. Yet even in that anonymity, he observed carefully. He noticed how confidence, even when understated, could smooth interactions. He learned that blending in was often more valuable than standing out. Brooklyn in the early 1900s offered a landscape that was both foreign and strangely familiar. The streets were busier, the buildings taller, but the neighborhoods echoed the communal life of Sicily. Italian immigrants clustered together, recreating pieces of their homeland through food, language, and custom. For Giuseppe, this environment provided a sense of continuity. He did not need to abandon his identity, he could adapt it. The old world values he carried found fertile ground among others who shared his background. Work was hard and often unrewarding. Like many immigrants, Profaci took on whatever opportunities he could find, learning quickly that persistence mattered more than comfort. Long hours and modest pay were accepted without complaint. These early years reinforced his patience and discipline. He was not drawn to reckless risk. Instead, he watched, listened, and waited. He understood that America rewarded those who positioned themselves carefully, those who recognized patterns before others did. What set Giuseppe apart was his ability to think beyond immediate survival. While others focused solely on getting through each day, he paid attention to how businesses operated, how goods moved through ports and warehouses, and how trust functioned as a form of currency within immigrant communities. He noticed which men were respected and which were merely feared. Respect, he realized, lasted longer. Fear faded once power shifted. This observation would later become central to his approach to leadership. Family remained at the center of his life. Marriage, children, and extended relatives formed a network of support and obligation. These relationships were not just personal, they were strategic. In tightly knit communities, family connections opened doors, provided protection, and reinforced credibility. Profaci never treated these bonds casually. He understood that loyalty, once broken, was nearly impossible to restore. As the years passed, Giuseppe Profaci became Joe Profaci, adapting his name as he adapted himself to his new surroundings. The change was subtle but significant, signaling a willingness to integrate without surrendering his core identity. He was becoming American, but on his own terms. He dressed conservatively, spoke carefully, and avoided unnecessary attention. This restraint made him easy to overlook, and in the world he was entering, being overlooked was often an advantage. The Brooklyn nights offered moments of reflection. After long days of work, Profaci would walk familiar streets, listening to the murmur of conversations drifting from open windows. He observed how disputes were handled, how influence spread quietly through favors and introductions rather than force. These observations reinforced his belief that power did not need to be loud to be effective. In fact, the loudest men often revealed their insecurity. America was not the land of effortless opportunity that many imagined. It demanded adaptation, compromise, and endurance. Yet for Profaci, these demands aligned perfectly with the lessons he had already learned. He was comfortable with gradual progress. He trusted systems more than impulses. While others grew frustrated or reckless, he remained steady, allowing time to work in his favor. This immigrant journey, from Villabate to Brooklyn, shaped everything that followed. It taught Profaci that survival depended on understanding both where you came from and where you now stood. He never forgot Sicily, but he never allowed nostalgia to cloud his judgment. Instead, he fused old-world discipline with new-world opportunity, creating a foundation that would support his rise in ways few could have predicted. As this chapter of his life settled into routine, the seeds of his future influence were already planted. He was not yet a figure of power, not yet a name spoken with caution. But the qualities that would define him were firmly in place: patience, observation, and an unwavering respect for structure. In the quiet spaces between work and rest, between tradition and adaptation, Joe Profaci was preparing for a role he would one day inhabit almost effortlessly. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, one thing was already clear: he was not a man who would rush toward his destiny. He would wait for it to come to him. In the years that followed his arrival in Brooklyn, Joe Profaci's life settled into a rhythm that appeared ordinary on the surface. He worked, provided for his family, attended church, and slowly built a reputation as a dependable man. Yet beneath this calm exterior, something more deliberate was taking shape. Profaci understood that stability in America often came from ownership, from controlling not just one's labor but the flow of goods themselves. It was this understanding that led him toward the olive oil business, a trade that would become both his livelihood and the foundation of his quiet rise. Olive oil was more than a commodity to Italian immigrants. It was a taste of home, a reminder of family meals and familiar landscapes left behind. Demand for it was constant, especially in neighborhoods where traditions were preserved carefully. Profaci recognized this early. Importing olive oil from Sicily offered legitimacy, reliability, and an entry point into commerce that required trust. Deals were often made between men who shared a common language and background, where a handshake carried meaning beyond a signed document. Setting up the business required patience and careful planning. Profaci navigated shipping schedules, customs inspections, and distribution networks with the same restraint he applied to every aspect of his life. He did not rush expansion. Instead, he focused on consistency. Customers learned that when they bought from Profaci, the product was genuine, the delivery timely, and the arrangement fair. Over time, his name became associated with reliability rather than risk. The warehouses and storefronts tied to the olive oil trade became quiet hubs of activity. Crates arrived and departed, invoices were recorded, and conversations unfolded in low voices. To outsiders, it was a modest operation. To those within the Italian-American community, it was a meeting point, a place where information flowed as freely as goods. Profaci listened more than he spoke. He absorbed details about who was struggling, who was expanding, and who needed assistance. These details mattered. They allowed him to position himself as a problem solver rather than a threat. What made the olive oil business particularly effective was its invisibility. There was nothing glamorous or suspicious about it. Law enforcement had little reason to pay attention to a food importer serving immigrant neighborhoods. This lack of scrutiny created space, and Profaci understood how to use it. Within that space, relationships deepened. Favors were exchanged. Obligations accumulated quietly, without the need for explicit demands. Money moved through the business steadily. Profaci reinvested carefully, expanding distribution routes and strengthening ties with suppliers in Sicily. Each transaction reinforced his reputation across both sides of the Atlantic. In Sicily, his reliability as a buyer earned respect. In New York, his ability to deliver goods built loyalty. This transatlantic network would later become a powerful asset, connecting Old World influence with New World opportunity. The olive oil trade also introduced Profaci to a different kind of authority. He was no longer just an employee or a worker, he was a man others depended on. Store owners relied on him to stock their shelves. Families relied on him to provide a familiar staple. Dependence, Profaci realized, was a subtle form of power. It did not provoke resentment the way fear often did. Instead, it encouraged cooperation and gratitude. As the business grew, Profaci's days became structured around routines that reinforced discipline. Mornings began early, with paperwork and planning. Afternoons involved visits to warehouses or meetings with distributors. Evenings were reserved for family and reflection. This predictability was intentional. Chaos invited mistakes, and mistakes attracted attention. Profaci preferred a life that moved forward quietly, step by step. Within the Italian-American community, the line between legitimate business and illicit opportunity was often thin. Profaci was careful not to cross it openly. He understood that legitimacy was his shield. At the same time, he recognized that his position allowed him to facilitate introductions and resolve disputes discreetly. When two parties disagreed, a neutral intermediary was valuable. Profaci often filled that role, offering solutions that preserved relationships rather than destroying them. These interactions gradually expanded his influence beyond commerce. People sought his opinion, his approval, his assistance. He rarely refused outright. Instead, he offered measured responses, creating a sense that his help came with expectations, even if they were never stated explicitly. This approach mirrored the traditions of Sicily, where favors created bonds stronger than contracts. The olive oil business also provided financial stability, which Profaci valued deeply. Unlike men who chased quick profits through risky ventures, he prioritized sustainability. Money was a tool, not a trophy. It allowed him to support his family, contribute to his church, and maintain an image of respectability. These visible signs of success reinforced his standing in the community, making his authority feel natural rather than imposed. At night, as the city settled and the streets grew quieter, Profaci often reflected on how far he had come. He did not see himself as a criminal mastermind or an aspiring kingpin. He saw himself as a man who understood systems and respected order. The olive oil crates stacked neatly in warehouses represented more than inventory, they symbolized control achieved through patience. This period of his life was defined by balance. He balanced old-world loyalty with new-world ambition, visibility with discretion, growth with restraint. The olive oil business sat at the center of this balance, anchoring him in legitimacy while opening doors to influence that extended far beyond commerce. It was here that Profaci refined the skills that would later define his leadership style, listening carefully, acting deliberately, and avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Though violence and overt criminal activity would eventually touch his world, they were not the foundation of his rise. That foundation was built quietly, one shipment at a time, one relationship at a time. In a city where power often announced itself loudly, Profaci's power whispered. And those who listened closely began to understand that behind the simple label of an olive oil importer stood a man whose reach was growing steadily, patiently, and with remarkable foresight. By the time others began to notice him, Joe Profaci was already firmly established. His business was thriving, his reputation solid, and his network extensive. What appeared to be an ordinary commercial success story was, in truth, the careful construction of an empire that required no violence to expand. The olive oil flowed steadily through Brooklyn, and with it flowed influence, shaping a future that Profaci continued to approach with the same calm determination that had guided him from the very beginning. As Joe Profaci's reputation grew quietly through commerce and community ties, another influence began to shape the direction of his life with equal subtlety. This influence did not announce itself openly, nor did it rely on sudden acts of violence. It was rooted in geography, memory, and shared origin. It was the Castellammarese connection, a bond formed not merely by criminal ambition, but by the deep familiarity of men who came from the same corners of Sicily and carried the same understanding of how power should be handled. Castellammare del Golfo and its surrounding towns had produced generations of men who believed in structure above all else. Loyalty to one's own people was considered sacred, and ambition was expected to move within well-defined boundaries. Joe Profaci, born in Villabate, shared this worldview. Though Villabate was distinct from Castellammare, the cultural closeness was undeniable. The language, customs, and codes of behavior aligned naturally. In America, where old identities often blurred, these shared roots became anchors. Within New York's Italian underworld, these ties formed invisible lines of alliance. Men from Castellammare and nearby regions gravitated toward one another, trusting familiar habits over uncertain promises. Profaci understood the value of this instinctively. He did not force connections, he allowed them to develop organically, through introductions, mutual favors, and shared memories of a homeland left behind but never forgotten. Meetings among these men were rarely dramatic. They took place in back rooms of businesses, in quiet apartments, or over simple meals where conversation flowed slowly. Discussions centered on practical matters, disputes to be resolved, opportunities to be considered, and boundaries to be respected. Profaci's role in these gatherings was often understated. He listened carefully, offering measured contributions that demonstrated reliability rather than dominance. Over time, his calm presence became a stabilizing force. This network of Castellammare's influence provided Profaci with protection as much as opportunity. In a world where alliances shifted quickly, belonging to a recognized faction offered security. It signaled to others that Profaci was not isolated, that any challenge to him would ripple outward. Yet this protection was never flaunted. Like everything else in Profaci's life, it remained implied rather than declared. As tensions simmered within New York's organized crime scene, these alliances took on greater significance. Rival factions, each with their own philosophies and leadership styles, began to maneuver for advantage. Some favored aggression, believing that dominance required visible strength. Others, like Profaci and his Castellammarese associates, favored patience and negotiation. To them, violence was a last resort, not a strategy. This contrast in approach would eventually shape the course of history. Men like Joe Profaci, with their appetite for control and public displays of power, represented a different vision of leadership. The Castellammarese, aligned with figures such as Salvatore Maranzano, believed in hierarchy and tradition. Profaci found himself naturally aligned with the latter, not because of blind loyalty, but because their values mirrored his own. During this period, Profaci continued to expand his influence quietly, using his business connections to facilitate introductions and smooth conflicts. He became a bridge between worlds, connecting legitimate commerce with underworld negotiations, all while maintaining an appearance of neutrality. This position required careful balance. Taking sides too openly could attract unwanted attention or resentment. Profaci avoided this by emphasizing shared interests rather than factional loyalty. The strength of the Castellammarese bond lay in its subtlety. There were no formal declarations, no public alliances. Instead, trust was built through consistency. When Profaci gave his word, he kept it. When disputes arose, his involvement often led to resolution rather than escalation. These qualities enhanced his standing within the network, making him a reliable ally in uncertain times. As the underworld edged closer to open conflict, Profaci's cautious approach became even more valuable. He did not rush to arm himself or provoke rivals. Instead, he ensured that his affairs were in order, his relationships solid, and his position defensible. He understood that wars were rarely won by the most aggressive participants. More often, they were survived by those who anticipated change and adapted quietly. In the background, conversations turned increasingly toward strategy. Who could be trusted? Which alliances would hold under pressure? Profaci listened, absorbing perspectives without committing himself too visibly. This restraint allowed him to remain flexible. Should the balance of power shift, he would be ready to adjust, guided by principles rather than personal grudges. The Castellammarese influence also reinforced Profaci's belief in lineage and tradition. He viewed leadership as something earned over time, validated by conduct rather than force. Younger men, eager to prove themselves, often underestimated this perspective. They mistook silence for weakness and patience for hesitation. Profaci, however, understood that time was his ally. Every year he survived without conflict strengthened his legitimacy. As night fell over Brooklyn, and the city's pace slowed, these alliances continued to operate beneath the surface. Messages were passed quietly. Decisions were made without spectacle. Profaci's involvement remained discreet, yet his presence was felt. He was becoming a man whose opinion mattered, whose support could tip the balance without ever being acknowledged publicly. This period of alignment with the Castellammarese faction did not propel Profaci into immediate prominence. Instead, it laid the groundwork for future survival. When the inevitable conflict arrived, those who had relied on aggression alone would find themselves exposed. Those who had cultivated patience and alliances would endure. Profaci belonged firmly to the latter group. By embedding himself within a network defined by shared origin and mutual respect, Profaci ensured that his rise would be gradual and resilient. The bonds he formed were not flashy, but they were durable. In a world where power often burned brightly and then vanished, these quiet alliances provided a steady flame. And as the city moved inexorably toward upheaval, Joe Profaci stood prepared, grounded in tradition, surrounded by familiar voices, and confident that silence, once again, would serve him better than noise. By the late 1920s, the quiet alliances and unspoken loyalties that had defined Joe Profaci's rise were tested by a storm that could no longer be avoided. Tension within New York's Italian underworld had been building for years, fueled by competing visions of leadership and control. What followed would later be known as the Castellammarese War, a violent struggle that reshaped organized crime in America. For many men, it was a period of reckless ambition and sudden death. For Profaci, it was a time to do what he did best, remain still while the world around him erupted. The conflict was rooted in a clash between two powerful figures, Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Masuria represented a new style of leadership, aggressive and unapologetic, while Maranzano embodied the old-world traditions favored by the Castellammarese faction. Profaci, aligned culturally and philosophically with Maranzano's camp, found himself navigating a dangerous landscape where choosing the wrong moment to act could be fatal. Yet even as alliances hardened and violence escalated, Profaci resisted the urge to involve himself directly. The streets of New York grew tense. Whispers of impending hits circulated through cafes and back rooms. Men who had once walked confidently now glanced over their shoulders. Gunfire, once rare, became an accepted risk. Amid this atmosphere of fear, Profaci maintained his routines. His businesses continued to operate. His public demeanor remained calm. This consistency was not ignorance, it was strategy. Panic drew attention, and attention invited danger. As Masuria and Maranzano maneuvered for dominance, Profaci observed carefully. He understood that wars of this kind often devoured their loudest participants first. Those who boasted, who sought recognition, who rushed to prove loyalty, frequently ended up exposed. Profaci chose instead to reinforce his existing relationships quietly. He ensured that his ties within the Castellammarese network remained intact, offering support without placing himself in the spotlight. Violence flared unpredictably. Assassinations occurred in broad daylight, sending shockwaves through the community. Each death shifted the balance of power, leaving vacancies that others rushed to fill. Profaci watched these developments with measured detachment. He did not celebrate victories or mourn losses publicly. In private, he assessed how each event altered the landscape. His goal was not triumph, but survival. When Salvatore Maranzano emerged as a leading figure following Masuria's assassination, the war appeared to be nearing its conclusion. For the Castellammarese faction, this was a moment of validation. Yet even in this apparent victory, Profaci remained cautious. He understood that power gained through bloodshed was unstable. Maranzano's attempt to formalize hierarchy and crown himself as the ultimate authority reflected a belief in tradition, but it also invited resentment from ambitious rivals. Profaci's position during this transition was delicate. He benefited from the ascendancy of his allies, yet he avoided overt alignment with Maranzano's more controversial decisions. When Maranzano was assassinated in 1931, it confirmed Profaci's instincts. No throne, however carefully constructed, was immune to challenge. The war had ended, but the lessons it offered were enduring. In the aftermath, New York's underworld was exhausted. Many leaders were dead, imprisoned, or discredited. Those who survived were forced to reconsider their approach. It was in this environment that a new system began to take shape, one that favored cooperation over constant conflict. Profaci emerged from the Castellammarese War not as a celebrated warrior, but as a man whose restraint had preserved his position. The war had altered him subtly. He had seen firsthand the cost of ambition unchecked by patience. He had witnessed how quickly alliances could collapse under pressure. These observations reinforced his belief that stability was the ultimate form of power. While others scrambled to rebuild, Profaci focused on reinforcing order within his sphere. He strengthened ties with associates who shared his outlook, favoring reliability over bravado. The atmosphere following the war was quieter, but not peaceful. Old grudges lingered, and new rivalries formed in the vacuum left by fallen leaders. Profaci navigated this uncertainty with care. He avoided unnecessary disputes, preferring negotiation and compromise. His reputation as a steady presence grew, not because he dominated others, but because he provided a sense of continuity in a fractured world. At night, as the city settled and memories of violence lingered in the air, Profaci reflected on the war's lessons. Survival, he concluded, was not about choosing the strongest side, but about understanding when not to choose at all. His ability to remain useful without becoming visible had saved him. It had allowed him to emerge intact while others disappeared. The Castellammarese War marked a turning point not just for organized crime, but for Profaci personally. It confirmed that his instincts were sound. Patience, discretion, and loyalty to structure had proven more effective than aggression. The world he now inhabited was reshaped, but his principles remained unchanged. As new leaders rose and systems evolved, Profaci stood ready to adapt. He had endured one of the most violent periods in mafia history without sacrificing his foundation. In doing so, he positioned himself for a future where influence would be measured not by how loudly it was asserted, but by how quietly it endured. The war had passed, but its echoes continued to shape every decision he made, reinforcing the truth he had learned long ago: in a world obsessed with power, survival itself was the greatest victory. When the violence of the Castellammarese War finally subsided, New York's criminal underworld found itself standing at a crossroads. The old ways, marked by personal vendettas and unchecked ambition, had proven costly and unsustainable. Many of the men who once commanded fear were gone, leaving behind a fractured system in desperate need of order. In this uncertain calm, a new structure began to emerge, one designed to prevent future wars and regulate power through cooperation rather than constant bloodshed. For Joe Profaci, this transition represented both validation and opportunity. The idea behind the commission was simple in theory but revolutionary in practice. Instead of allowing one man to dominate through force, the leaders of the major crime families would share authority, resolve disputes collectively, and establish boundaries that reduced open conflict. This approach favored men who valued stability and long-term thinking, qualities Profaci had demonstrated consistently. While others sought recognition for their role in shaping the new order, Profaci accepted his place without spectacle, understanding that influence did not require applause. Profaci's recognition as the head of his own family was not accompanied by celebration or dramatic announcement. It unfolded quietly, acknowledged through nods, meetings, and mutual understanding among those who mattered. He did not style himself as a visionary or reformer. Instead, he presented himself as a steward, a man entrusted with maintaining balance within his domain. This framing aligned perfectly with his temperament and reinforced his legitimacy. Participation in the commission required a certain discipline. Decisions were to be discussed rather than imposed, and compromise was often necessary. Profaci adapted easily to this environment. He spoke when needed, listened attentively, and avoided confrontational language. His contributions were measured and practical, focused on preserving order rather than asserting dominance. Over time, this approach earned him respect, even from more assertive figures who recognized the value of his steadiness. Unlike some of his peers, Profaci showed little interest in expanding his influence beyond manageable limits. He believed that overextension invited instability. By focusing on consolidating his existing territory and maintaining clear lines of authority, he ensured that his family remained cohesive. This restraint distinguished him in an era when ambition often led to reckless expansion. The commission also provided Profaci with a buffer against external threats. Disputes that might once have escalated into violence were now addressed through negotiation. This system played to Profaci's strengths. He was adept at framing conflicts in ways that emphasized mutual benefit and long-term consequences. His calm demeanor helped diffuse tensions, reinforcing his reputation as a stabilizing presence. Within his own family, Profaci emphasized adherence to rules and respect for hierarchy. He viewed these principles not as constraints, but as safeguards. Regular meetings reinforced expectations, and tributes were collected methodically. While some under his leadership viewed these demands as burdensome, Profaci saw them as necessary to maintain order and ensure the family's survival within the larger structure of the commission. The contrast between Profaci and more flamboyant figures of the era was striking. While others courted attention through lavish lifestyles or public gestures of power, Profaci maintained a modest profile. His wealth was evident but understated. His authority was unquestioned but rarely displayed. This invisibility served him well, allowing him to operate without attracting unnecessary scrutiny from law enforcement or the public. As the years passed, the Commission solidified its role as the governing body of organized crime in New York. Profaci's consistent participation reinforced his standing within this council. He was not the loudest voice, but he was among the most reliable. When he spoke, it was with purpose, often reminding others of the cost of disorder and the value of restraint. This period also marked a deepening of Profaci's commitment to tradition. He believed that the Commission should function not as a platform for individual ambition, but as a mechanism to preserve collective stability. This perspective sometimes put him at odds with younger leaders who were eager to push boundaries. Yet Profaci remained firm, convinced that the lessons of the Castellamarese War should not be forgotten. At night, as the city settled into its familiar rhythms, Profaci reflected on the transformation he had witnessed. The underworld had evolved from a patchwork of competing factions into a more organized system. His own role within this system affirmed the path he had chosen years earlier. Patience had not only preserved him, it had positioned him as a guardian of order. Despite this success, Profaci was not complacent. He understood that systems, no matter how well designed, were only as strong as the men who upheld them. He remained vigilant, monitoring shifts in loyalty and ambition within his family and beyond. His leadership style, grounded in routine and predictability, aimed to minimize surprises. The Commission era represented the height of Profaci's influence, even if it never brought him fame. He ruled from the shadows, content to let others occupy the spotlight. In doing so, he achieved something rare in his world, sustained authority without constant conflict. This quiet reign, anchored by the structure of the Commission, would define his legacy and set the stage for both the stability and the tensions that followed. In the end, Profaci's seat on the Commission symbolized more than power. It represented a philosophy, one that valued order over ego, patience over spectacle. As New York's underworld moved forward into a new chapter, Joe Profaci remained what he had always been, a man who understood that the strongest influence was often the one least visible, and that true control required no announcement at all. With the Commission now shaping the boundaries of power in New York, Joe Profaci turned his attention inward, focusing on the structure and discipline of his own family. To him, leadership was not a performance but a responsibility, one that demanded consistency and clarity. He believed that a family held together by rules would outlast one driven by fear alone. Every decision he made reflected this belief, reinforcing a system where authority flowed downward in an orderly, predictable way. Profaci's approach to leadership was rooted in obligation. Each member of the family understood what was expected of him, and those expectations rarely changed. Tribute was central to this system. Regular payments were not merely a financial requirement, they were a reaffirmation of loyalty. By contributing, soldiers and captains acknowledged Profaci's authority and their place within the hierarchy. To Profaci, this ritual was essential. It reminded everyone involved that the family functioned as a unified entity rather than a collection of independent operators. These tributes were collected methodically, without fanfare. There were no dramatic confrontations or public displays. Meetings were calm, business-like affairs where numbers were discussed quietly and records were kept with care. Profaci insisted on accuracy and punctuality, viewing these traits as reflections of discipline. Those who complied found stability and protection. Those who resisted were not immediately punished, instead, they were watched carefully, their loyalty measured over time. This measured response was deliberate. Profaci understood that fear could secure obedience in the short term, but resentment grew silently. By allowing space for compliance, he maintained the appearance of fairness, even as his expectations remained firm. Over time, this approach reinforced his authority more effectively than violence ever could. Members came to understand that Profaci was patient, but not forgiving of repeated defiance. Within the family, roles were clearly defined. Captains managed their crews with autonomy, as long as they adhered to established rules. Profaci did not interfere unnecessarily. He believed that micromanagement weakened leadership by eroding trust. Instead, he evaluated outcomes. If a captain maintained order and delivered tribute reliably, he retained Profaci's confidence. This hands-off style encouraged responsibility while preserving centralized control. Family meetings were conducted with restraint. Profaci spoke in measured tones, rarely raising his voice. He favored reminders over threats, emphasizing the importance of unity and tradition. Younger members often found this style frustrating, interpreting calmness as softness. They did not always grasp that Profaci's authority was reinforced by decades of survival and a network of alliances extending beyond their immediate view. Despite this outward calm, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The financial demands of tribute weighed heavily on some members, especially those struggling to expand their own operations. They began to question whether Profaci's expectations were reasonable or simply self-serving. These doubts were rarely expressed openly, but they circulated quietly, passed in whispers and private conversations. Profaci was not unaware of this discontent. He observed shifts in behavior, changes in tone, subtle delays in payments. Rather than reacting impulsively, he gathered information. He believed that understanding the source of dissatisfaction was more valuable than suppressing it outright. This intelligence allowed him to anticipate challenges before they became crises. In private, Profaci viewed the tribute system as a necessary safeguard. The fund supported the family's operations, resolved disputes, and provided assistance to those in need. They also reinforced the family's position within the larger structure of the commission. From his perspective, these contributions ensured collective strength. Without them, fragmentation was inevitable. The contrast between Profaci's orderly system and the more aggressive styles adopted by other families was noticeable. While violence flared elsewhere, Profaci's territory remained relatively stable. This stability attracted those who valued predictability, further strengthening his position. However, it also highlighted differences in philosophy that would later fuel internal conflict. As years passed, generational divides widened. Younger members, raised in America and less connected to Sicilian traditions, questioned the relevance of old rules. They sought quicker rewards and greater autonomy. Profaci, steadfast in his beliefs, saw these attitudes as dangerous. To him, abandoning tradition meant inviting chaos. Even in moments of strain, Profaci maintained his composure. He continued to attend church, to present himself as a respectable businessman, to reinforce the image of a leader guided by principle. This consistency reassured some while frustrating others. It became clear that Profaci's strength lay not in adaptability, but in unwavering commitment to his system. At night, as the city's noise faded, Profaci reflected on the balance he sought to maintain. Authority required distance, but distance risked alienation. He walked this line carefully, trusting that time and structure would resolve most issues. He had seen chaos before and survived it. He believed that discipline, even when unpopular, was the only path to longevity. This period marked the height of Profaci's internal control. His family operated efficiently, his authority remained intact, and his position within the commission was secure. Yet beneath this surface order, dissatisfaction continued to grow. The tribute system, once accepted as tradition, was increasingly viewed as a burden. The seeds of rebellion were being planted quietly, much as Profaci himself had once planted the seeds of his own rise. For now, the system held. Payments were made, meetings conducted, and rules enforced. Profaci remained the undisputed head of his family, ruling through expectation rather than fear. But history would soon test whether patience and tradition could withstand the pressures of change. As always, Profaci trusted in silence, believing that order, once established, would sustain itself. He could not yet know that this very rigidity would one day challenge the stability he had worked so carefully to build. To those who observed him casually, Joe Profaci appeared to embody the ideals of respectability. He was a devoted family man, a regular presence at church, and a generous contributor to religious and community causes. This image was not hastily constructed, nor was it entirely false. Faith and tradition genuinely mattered to him, forming a moral framework that guided his public life. Yet beneath this surface of devotion and charity lay a disciplined system of control that relied as much on appearances as on authority. Sunday mornings followed a familiar pattern. Profaci dressed neatly, his demeanor calm and unassuming, as he took his place among other parishioners. The church was filled with soft light filtering through stained glass, casting muted colors across wooden pews. The ritual of Mass offered a sense of order and continuity, qualities Profaci valued deeply. Here, he was one man among many, participating in traditions that connected him to both his Sicilian roots and his adopted homeland. His contributions to the church were generous and consistent. Donations supported renovations, festivals, and charitable outreach. To the community, these gestures reinforced his reputation as a pillar of stability. Priests spoke of him with respect, seeing a man who gave without drawing attention to himself. This respectability served a purpose beyond goodwill. It anchored Profaci within the community, creating layers of insulation that discouraged scrutiny. Faith, for Profaci, was not merely performative. He genuinely believed in order, hierarchy, and obligation, values deeply embedded in Catholic teaching as he understood it. The structure of the Church, with its clear lines of authority and ritual, mirrored the systems he built within his own organization. Confession, penance, and absolution offered a way to reconcile actions with belief, reinforcing the idea that discipline could coexist with transgression. At the same time, Profaci understood the power of perception. By aligning himself visibly with faith and charity, he cultivated trust. Trust opened doors and softened suspicion. In neighborhoods where the church functioned as a social center, his presence signaled belonging. He was not an outsider or a disruptor, he was part of the fabric of everyday life. This mask of respectability extended into his business dealings. Profaci's enterprises were conducted openly, with records maintained and obligations met. He avoided associations that might draw unwanted attention, preferring partnerships grounded in reliability. His legitimacy was carefully maintained, not as a facade, but as a strategic layer that reinforced his authority while keeping it concealed. The duality of Profaci's life required constant balance. On one side stood his public persona, the devout Catholic, the generous benefactor, the quiet businessman. On the other side lay his role as a crime boss, enforcing discipline and collecting tribute. These worlds rarely collided openly. Profaci ensured that boundaries were respected, that meetings and decisions remained discreet. This separation preserved both realms, allowing each to function without compromising the other. Within his organization, faith and tradition were often invoked to reinforce obedience. Profaci spoke of loyalty as a moral duty, of hierarchy as a natural order. These concepts resonated with older members who shared his background, reinforcing their commitment. Younger members, less connected to these traditions, sometimes viewed such rhetoric as manipulative. Yet even they recognized the effectiveness of this approach. By framing authority as tradition rather than coercion, Profaci reduced open resistance. Community events offered additional opportunities to reinforce his standing. Festivals, fundraisers, and family celebrations allowed Profaci to be seen as a supportive presence. These gatherings were filled with music, food, and conversation, creating an atmosphere of warmth and familiarity. Behind the scenes, however, relationships were being strengthened and obligations reinforced. A shared meal could be as powerful as a formal agreement. The church also served as a neutral space, a place where rivalries were set aside and conflicts softened. Profaci valued this neutrality. It provided a setting where discussions could occur under the guise of community concern. The sanctity of the space discouraged overt hostility, reinforcing the calm, controlled approach he favored. Despite the serenity of these settings, Profaci never forgot the realities of his world. He remained vigilant, aware that appearances could protect only so much. His faith did not blind him to danger. Instead, it reinforced his belief in order and discipline as safeguards against chaos. He believed that by adhering to structure, both spiritual and organizational, he could maintain control. As years passed, this carefully maintained duality became central to Profaci's identity. He was both a man of faith and a man of power, navigating these roles with practiced ease. To outsiders, the contrast might have seemed contradictory. To Profaci, it was harmonious. Each aspect supported the other, creating a stable foundation for his authority. At night, in moments of quiet reflection, Profaci considered the balance he had achieved. He believed that his adherence to tradition distinguished him from more reckless figures. While others chased notoriety, he cultivated respect. While others relied on fear, he relied on obligation and shared values. This approach, he believed, would endure. Yet beneath this confidence lay an unspoken truth: respectability could not resolve every conflict. As generational shifts continued and dissent grew within his organization, the limits of tradition would be tested. For now, however, Profaci remained convinced that faith, charity, and controlled authority formed an unbreakable shield. The bells of the church continued to ring each Sunday, marking time with steady certainty. Profaci listened, finding comfort in their rhythm. They reminded him that systems built on ritual and belief could outlast turmoil. Whether this belief would hold in the face of changing loyalties remained to be seen. But for this moment, Joe Profaci stood firmly at the intersection of faith and power, convinced that the calm he projected would preserve the order he so carefully maintained. As the years passed and Joe Profaci's authority appeared outwardly secure, subtle changes began to ripple through the structure he had built so carefully. They were not loud or dramatic at first. There were no open challenges, no sudden acts of defiance. Instead, the earliest signs of trouble emerged quietly, in pauses that lingered too long, in glances exchanged during meetings, in payments that arrived just a little later than expected. To an untrained eye, these details meant nothing. To Profaci, they signaled the slow formation of dissent. The world around him was changing, and the men under his command were changing with it. Many of the younger members had grown up entirely in America, shaped less by Sicilian tradition and more by the restless energy of New York streets. They were ambitious, impatient, and less inclined to accept authority simply because it had always existed. To them, Profaci's rigid system of tribute felt burdensome, an arrangement that seemed to benefit the top while limiting their own progress. Whispers began to circulate in private spaces, away from formal meetings. Some spoke of fairness, questioning why contributions remained high even as profits fluctuated. Others spoke of respect, suggesting that loyalty should be rewarded more generously. These conversations were cautious, often framed as concerns rather than complaints. Yet beneath the careful language lay frustration, growing steadily with each passing year. Profaci listened more than he spoke, and he noticed these shifts. He observed patterns, noting which individuals expressed dissatisfaction and which remained loyal. His response was measured. Rather than confronting the issue openly, he reinforced routines. Meetings continued as scheduled. Expectations remained unchanged. To Profaci, consistency was a form of reassurance, a way to remind his family that stability endured. This approach, however, had unintended consequences. For those already discontented, the absence of change felt like dismissal. They interpreted Profaci's silence not as patience, but as indifference. The gap between leadership and rank began to widen, fueled by differing expectations and experiences. Older members, rooted in tradition, remained largely supportive. Younger ones, driven by ambition, grew increasingly restless. Within this atmosphere, certain personalities began to stand out. These men were not yet leaders of opposition, but they voiced their opinions more openly in trusted circles. They questioned whether Profaci understood the pressures faced by those on the street. They wondered aloud if his insistence on tribute reflected greed rather than necessity. These ideas, once introduced, lingered, spreading gradually. Profaci's health was also beginning to decline, though he did not advertise it. He remained present, but his physical presence lacked the energy it once had. Some interpreted this as vulnerability. In a world where strength was often equated with visibility, any sign of weakness invited speculation. Profaci's calm demeanor, once reassuring, now seemed distant to some. The sense of obligation that had once bound the family together began to feel strained. Members continued to pay tribute, but the ritual felt hollow to those who questioned its purpose. Loyalty, once reinforced by shared values, now required justification. Profaci believed that obligation was self-evident, rooted in tradition and structure. His critics believed it needed renewal. This growing divide did not yet erupt into conflict, but it created an undercurrent of tension that affected everyday interactions. Conversations grew guarded. Trust, once assumed, now required affirmation. Profaci sensed this shift, but his response remained anchored in the belief that time and discipline would resolve the issue. He had seen unrest before and survived it. He trusted the system he had built. In private moments, Profaci reflected on the nature of authority. He believed that leadership required distance, that familiarity weakened respect. Yet he also recognized that distance could breed misunderstanding. Balancing these realities became increasingly difficult as expectations diverged. Profaci's world, shaped by tradition and patience, was colliding with a new generation's demand for immediacy. The nights grew heavier with thought. Profaci, ever disciplined, maintained his routines, but the weight of maintaining control pressed quietly on him. He continued to attend church, to conduct business, to present a composed exterior. Beneath that surface, he considered the possibility that his methods, once effective, might now be perceived as rigid. Despite these doubts, Profaci did not alter his course. He believed that concessions would signal weakness, encouraging further demands. Stability, he reasoned, required firmness. He chose to wait, confident that dissent would fade as quickly as it had emerged. After all, the family still functioned. Operations continued. Tribute was paid. From his perspective, order remained intact. Yet history often turns not on dramatic gestures, but on accumulated grievances left unaddressed. The dissatisfaction within Profaci's family continued to grow, fed by generational change and unmet expectations. What began as quiet murmurs would eventually seek expression, and the calm Profaci relied upon would be tested. For now, the silence held. Meetings concluded without incident. The city outside carried on, indifferent to the tensions unfolding in back rooms and private conversations. Profaci remained at the center, composed and deliberate, trusting in the structures he had built over decades. As he moved through his days, he could not know that the very qualities that had ensured his survival, patience, restraint, and unwavering adherence to tradition, were becoming sources of friction. The cost of silence was accumulating, even if its consequences were not yet visible. And in that growing quiet, the seeds of conflict continued to take root, waiting for the moment when they could no longer be contained. The tension that had been building quietly within Joe Profaci's family could not remain contained forever. What began as dissatisfaction and whispered grievances now edged closer to open defiance. The presence of Joe Gallo transformed unease into momentum, and momentum into confrontation. The family, once bound by routine and obligation, found itself divided in ways that could no longer be ignored. This was not a sudden explosion, but a slow fracture, spreading through relationships that had once seemed unbreakable. As disagreements intensified, trust eroded. Conversations that once flowed easily became cautious, measured. Men began choosing their words carefully, aware that loyalties were shifting. Profaci sensed this change acutely. The silence he had long relied upon now carried a different weight. It was no longer the calm of order, but the quiet of anticipation. Something was coming, and everyone felt it. Joe Gallo's defiance grew bolder. He no longer confined his complaints to private circles. His frustration with tribute demands and leadership decisions became more direct, more difficult to dismiss as idle talk. To his supporters, this openness was a sign of courage. To Profaci, it was a challenge to authority that risked unraveling everything he had built. Yet even now, Profaci resisted immediate retaliation. He understood that violence within one's own family carried consequences far beyond the immediate conflict. The family split subtly at first. Meetings revealed shifting alliances through who sat beside whom, who spoke in agreement, who remained silent. Profaci's loyalists, often older and deeply rooted in tradition, stood firmly behind him. Gallo's supporters, younger and more restless, gravitated toward one another, united by shared frustration. These divisions hardened over time, turning differences of opinion into opposing camps. The atmosphere grew heavy with suspicion. Men questioned motives, re-examined past interactions, and wondered who could still be trusted. Profaci's insistence on order now required constant reinforcement. He reminded his captains of the consequences of division, of the wars that had devastated families before them. He spoke of unity as survival. But his words, once accepted without question, now competed with alternative visions of loyalty. When confrontations did occur, they were restrained but charged. Voices rose briefly before settling back into uneasy calm. No one wanted to be the first to cross an irreversible line. Yet each unresolved clash deepened resentment. Profaci's patience, once a strength, was increasingly perceived as reluctance. Gallo's persistence, once tolerated, now felt like provocation. Outside forces watched closely. Rival families, aware of internal discord, monitored the situation with interest. Weakness, once exposed, invited interference. Profaci understood this danger intimately. Internal war did not remain internal for long. It spread, drawing in opportunists eager to exploit division. This awareness heightened the stakes of every decision he made. Eventually, restraint gave way to action. The conflict escalated into what would later be known as the Gallo War, a period of internal strife marked not by open battles, but by calculated moves and mounting tension. Kidnappings, retaliatory gestures, and covert operations replaced negotiation. Each act deepened mistrust, making reconciliation increasingly unlikely. Profaci found himself fighting not just for control, but for the survival of his leadership philosophy. He believed that yielding to Gallo's demands would set a precedent, encouraging further challenges. Yet suppressing the rebellion risked tearing the family apart. This dilemma weighed heavily on him, forcing choices that offered no clear victory. As the conflict unfolded, Profaci's health began to suffer. Stress compounded existing ailments, draining his energy. Despite this, he remained engaged, issuing directives and maintaining the appearance of control. His resolve did not waver, even as his strength did. He believed that stepping back would invite collapse. The violence, though restrained compared to earlier mafia wars, left a lasting impact. Families were strained, alliances shattered, and trust irreparably damaged. The sense of unity that once defined Profaci's organization was gone. In its place stood a fractured structure held together by necessity rather than loyalty. For Gallo and his followers, the conflict validated their grievances. They saw themselves as agents of change, challenging a system they viewed as outdated. For Profaci, it was a tragic confirmation that tradition alone could no longer guarantee obedience. The world he had navigated so carefully was slipping beyond his control. As nights grew longer and decisions heavier, Profaci reflected on the irony of his situation. He had survived external wars through patience and discretion, only to face his greatest challenge from within. The family he had nurtured was now the source of his greatest vulnerability. The internal war did not resolve cleanly. It lingered, casting a shadow over every interaction. Even moments of calm felt temporary, fragile. Profaci continued to rule, but his authority was no longer absolute. It was contested, strained by forces he could not fully suppress or satisfy. In this period of unrest, the limits of silence became clear. What once maintained order now concealed fractures until they widened beyond repair. The Gallo conflict marked a turning point, not just in Profaci's leadership, but in the nature of organized crime itself. The old balance between tradition and ambition was breaking down, giving way to a more volatile future. As the dust settled temporarily, one truth emerged unmistakably: the family would never return to the quiet stability it once knew. Profaci remained at its head, but the shadows he ruled from had grown restless. The cost of internal conflict had been paid in loyalty and trust, currencies far harder to replenish than money or territory. And as the war simmered on, it became clear that even the most patient ruler could not escape the consequences of change. By the time the internal conflict had settled into an uneasy stalemate, Joe Profaci was no longer the man he had once been. The years of tension, negotiation, and quiet warfare had taken their toll. His body, once sustained by routine and discipline, now showed signs of strain. Illness crept in gradually, mirroring the slow erosion of his authority. To the outside world, he remained the boss, composed and deliberate. Within, however, the weight of leadership pressed more heavily than ever before. Profaci's health began to fail in ways that could not be ignored. Periods of fatigue lengthened, and moments of clarity were increasingly interrupted by pain. Hospital visits became more frequent, though he ensured they remained discreet. He understood the danger of appearing weak in a world where strength was currency. Even so, those closest to him noticed the change. His movements slowed. His presence, though still commanding, carried a sense of fragility. The hospital rooms he occupied were quiet, filled with the steady hum of machinery and the muted sounds of distant footsteps. These spaces contrasted sharply with the back rooms and offices where he had once conducted business. Here, decisions were made by doctors rather than subordinates, and control was limited. For a man accustomed to command, this loss of autonomy was unsettling. Yet Profaci accepted it with the same restraint he applied to everything else. Despite his condition, Profaci refused to relinquish authority. Meetings were relocated, sometimes taking place in private rooms or at his home. He continued to receive reports, issue instructions, and monitor developments within his family. His voice remained calm, his expectations unchanged. To him, stepping aside would invite chaos, and chaos was unacceptable. The conflict with the Gallo faction lingered in the background, unresolved and exhausting. Though outright violence had subsided, mistrust persisted. Profaci's illness complicated matters further. Supporters worried about succession, while rivals speculated about opportunities. The uncertainty surrounding his health became another source of tension, adding to the strain already present. Profaci was keenly aware of these dynamics. In moments of solitude, he reflected on the nature of power and its impermanence. He had built his authority through patience and structure, yet now found himself confronting limits that could not be negotiated away. The body, unlike organizations, did not respond to discipline alone. Faith became an even greater source of comfort during this period. Profaci spent long hours in quiet reflection, drawing solace from familiar prayers and rituals. These moments offered a sense of continuity amid uncertainty. They reinforced his belief that order existed beyond human control, that acceptance was sometimes necessary. Family members visited, offering support and reassurance. These interactions were gentle, filled with concern. Profaci valued these moments, though he rarely expressed vulnerability openly. He remained the patriarch, the steady presence, even as his strength waned. This duality, fragility and authority, defined his final years. Within the organization, day-to-day operations continued, but the absence of Profaci's full presence was felt. Decisions took longer. Disputes lingered unresolved. Captains accustomed to clear guidance found themselves navigating uncertainty. Profaci's leadership, once central and stabilizing, now functioned more as a symbol than an active force. Some interpreted this shift as an opportunity. Others viewed it as a warning. The balance Profaci had maintained for decades was faltering, and the family struggled to adapt. His illness accelerated changes that had already begun, exposing vulnerabilities long concealed. At night, as he rested, Profaci's thoughts turned to legacy. He considered the system he had built, the choices he had made, and the conflicts he had endured. He wondered whether his adherence to tradition had preserved stability or delayed inevitable change. These reflections were quiet, personal, and unresolved. Despite his declining health, Profaci's resolve remained intact. He continued to believe in order, in the necessity of structure. Even as his body weakened, his mind clung to the principles that had guided his life. He hoped that these principles would outlast him, providing continuity after his passing. The world outside continued to move forward, indifferent to his struggles. The city's noise drifted in through windows, reminder that life did not pause. Profaci listened, aware that his time was drawing closer to an end. The power he had wielded so quietly was slipping beyond his grasp, not through rebellion, but through mortality. In these final years, Joe Profaci's reign took on a somber tone. The shadows he had ruled from grew longer, filled with uncertainty and reflection. His authority, though still acknowledged, lacked the vitality it once had. The man who had survived wars and internal conflict now faced the one challenge no strategy could overcome. As illness continued its slow advance, Profaci remained what he had always been, composed, deliberate, and deeply committed to his sense of order. His presence, even diminished, commanded respect. Yet the inevitability of change loomed. The family, the organization, and the city itself were preparing, consciously or not, for a future without him. And in that quiet preparation lay the final chapter of a life defined not by spectacle, but by endurance. The end of Joe Profaci's life did not arrive with the sudden violence so common in the world he inhabited. There was no dramatic ambush, no final betrayal carried out in a crowded street or dimly lit room. Instead, his death came quietly, almost fittingly, as the final chapter of a man who had always ruled without spectacle. In 1962, as the city moved on with its relentless pace, Joe Profaci slipped away, weakened by illness, leaving behind an empire that was already beginning to drift without its anchor. In the months leading up to his death, Profaci's world had grown smaller. His movements were limited, his energy diminished, and the meetings that once defined his days became shorter and less frequent. Yet his mind remained engaged. He continued to listen, to weigh information, to offer guidance when asked. Even as his body failed him, he clung to the belief that leadership was not something one abandoned simply because it had become difficult. Those who visited him during this period sensed the gravity of the moment, even if it was never spoken aloud. Conversations were softer, more reflective. Old stories surfaced, reminders of years when decisions had been made with confidence and clarity. Profaci listened more than he spoke, his presence calm, almost reassuring. He had spent a lifetime projecting control, and even now, he did not allow uncertainty to dominate the room. Cancer, the illness that would claim him, worked steadily and without drama. It eroded his strength in the same gradual way he himself had once eroded obstacles to power. There was an irony in that symmetry, though Profaci never remarked on it. He accepted his condition with the same restraint that defined every other aspect of his life. There were no public appeals for sympathy, no visible signs of fear. His decline remained largely private, known only to family and a small circle of trusted associates. As word of his failing health spread quietly through the underworld, reactions were mixed. Some felt genuine concern, recognizing the end of an era. Others viewed the situation pragmatically, considering what his absence would mean for the balance of power. Profaci had long understood that loyalty in his world was conditional, shaped by necessity as much as respect. This knowledge did not embitter him. It simply reinforced his belief that systems mattered more than individuals. The day of his death passed without incident. There were no sirens, no crowds gathering in the street. Joe Profaci died as he had lived, quietly, away from the spotlight. News of his passing traveled through whispered conversations and discreet phone calls. Within hours, the implications were already being discussed. Leadership positions, alliances, and unresolved conflicts all came into sharper focus. For his family, both biological and criminal, the loss was profound. Profaci had been a constant presence for decades, a figure whose authority had shaped routines and expectations. Without him, uncertainty filled the space he left behind. The question was not just who would lead, but how. Profaci's style was deeply personal, rooted in patience and tradition. Replicating it would not be easy. His funeral reflected the duality of his life. To the public, it was the farewell of a respected businessman and community member. The church filled with mourners, the air heavy with incense and subdued emotion. Prayers were offered, hymns sung, and words of comfort spoken. Those who knew only his public persona saw nothing unusual, nothing to suggest the depth of influence he had wielded. Behind the scenes, however, the gathering carried additional meaning. Men who had operated under Profaci's authority stood side by side, their expressions controlled. Each gesture, each exchange of words, was measured. This was not only a moment of mourning, but a moment of transition. Alliances were silently assessed, intentions quietly inferred. As Profaci was laid to rest, the contrast between his end and the ends of so many others in his world was striking. He had not died violently. He had not been betrayed by his closest allies. He had not been cut down in his prime. Instead, he had reached old age, succumbing to illness after decades of power. In a profession where longevity was rare, this alone set him apart. Yet his peaceful death did not mean peace would follow. The conflicts that had simmered during his final years did not disappear with him. If anything, they intensified. Without Profaci's steady hand, divisions deepened. The structure he had built, once held together by his presence, began to strain under new pressures. In the days that followed, conversations turned increasingly toward succession. Names were mentioned, weighed, debated. Some believed continuity was essential, that the family should remain as close as possible to Profaci's vision. Others saw an opportunity for change, a chance to reshape the organization to suit a new generation. Profaci, had he been able to observe these discussions, would not have been surprised. He had anticipated them long before his death. What lingered most strongly in the wake of his passing was a sense of ambiguity. Profaci's legacy was not easily defined. He was neither a flamboyant tyrant nor a romanticized outlaw. He was a man who valued order above all else, who believed that power was best exercised quietly. For some, this made him forgettable. For others, it made him formidable. As the city continued its routines, few outside a small circle took notice of Joe Profaci's death. There were no headlines celebrating his life, no public reckoning with his influence. This anonymity might have disappointed another man. For Profaci, it was fitting. He had never sought recognition from the world at large. His concern had always been with control, stability, and survival. In the end, Joe Profaci left behind a paradox. He was a powerful man whose absence was felt deeply by those who depended on him, yet barely registered beyond that sphere. His death marked the conclusion of a chapter defined by restraint, discipline, and quiet authority. What followed would be louder, more chaotic, and far less controlled. As the shadows he once ruled from shifted and reshaped themselves around new figures, one truth became clear. Joe Profaci's greatest achievement was not the wealth he accumulated or the territory he controlled, but the simple fact that he endured. In a world that devoured its leaders with alarming regularity, he had lived long enough to die on his own terms. And in doing so, he left behind a silence that spoke volumes about the kind of power he had truly possessed. In the days following Joe Profaci's death, the absence he left behind became impossible to ignore. The structure he had maintained for decades now stood without its central pillar, and every part of the organization felt the strain. Meetings continued, businesses operated, and tribute was still collected, but the rhythm had changed. What once felt steady now felt uncertain, as though everyone involved was waiting for someone else to speak first. Joseph Magliocco, Profaci's brother-in-law, stepped into the role of boss almost by default. His succession was logical on paper, rooted in family ties and Profaci's quiet approval before his death. Yet authority in this world was rarely secured by logic alone. Magliocco inherited not only a title, but a fractured organization burdened by unresolved conflict and lingering resentment. The calm order Profaci had enforced could not be replicated overnight. Magliocco's leadership style differed subtly but significantly. He lacked Profaci's decades of experience and the quiet confidence that came with long survival. While he attempted to maintain continuity, his authority was immediately tested. The Gallo faction, still resentful and emboldened by Profaci's absence, saw little reason to restrain themselves. What had once been a simmering conflict now threatened to boil over. Within the family, uncertainty spread. Captains and soldiers weighed their options, reassessing loyalties. Some remained committed to the existing structure, believing stability was still possible. Others questioned whether Magliocco could command the respect Profaci once did. Without the unifying presence of the former boss, divisions hardened, making compromise increasingly difficult. Magliocco attempted to assert control through formal channels. Meetings were called, expectations restated, and discipline emphasized. Yet these efforts often felt reactive rather than authoritative. Where Profaci's words had carried the weight of history, Magliocco's carried the burden of transition. Each decision was scrutinized, each misstep magnified. The wider mafia landscape took notice. Rival families observed the situation closely, aware that instability created opportunity. The Commission, once a stabilizing force under Profaci's participation, now faced internal strain as well. Magliocco's relationship with other leaders lacked the depth Profaci had cultivated. Negotiations became more complex, trust less assured. The Gallo faction intensified its challenge, viewing the transition as a moment to push for change. Acts of defiance grew bolder, forcing Magliocco to respond. These responses, however, often escalated tension rather than resolved it. The family found itself drifting further from the order Profaci had prized, sliding toward open conflict. Amid this turmoil, the legacy of Profaci loomed large. His absence highlighted the effectiveness of his leadership, even for those who had once criticized him. The routines he established, the discipline he enforced, and the silence he maintained now seemed like safeguards that had been taken for granted. Without them, chaos felt closer. Magliocco faced pressure from multiple directions. Older members urged caution, advocating for a return to Profaci's methods. Younger members demanded reform, seeing the transition as a chance to reshape the organization. Balancing these demands proved difficult. Each attempt to satisfy one side alienated the other. As weeks turned into months, it became clear that the family was at a crossroads. The question was no longer simply who would lead, but what kind of leadership would define the future. Profaci's era had been one of restraint and tradition. The emerging era promised volatility and confrontation. The emotional weight of this transition affected everyone involved. Loyalty, once assumed, now required negotiation. Trust, once implicit, had to be earned anew. The sense of unity that Profaci had cultivated was gone, replaced by cautious alliances and guarded interactions. In quiet moments, some reflected on Profaci's final years, recognizing the signs they had overlooked. His illness had been more than a personal struggle, it had been a warning of what was to come. The family had relied heavily on his presence, failing to prepare for life without him. Magliocco's reign would ultimately prove short-lived, undermined by internal dissent and external pressure. But in these early days after Profaci's death, the full extent of that failure was not yet apparent. What was clear, however, was that the stability Profaci had maintained could not be preserved by succession alone. The streets of Brooklyn and beyond continued their routines, indifferent to the shifting power beneath them. Life moved on, as it always did. Yet for those within the organization, the loss of Profaci marked the end of an era. His shadow lingered, shaping expectations and comparisons, even as the structure he built began to crumble. In the absence of Joe Profaci, the family faced its most defining challenge. Could it adapt without losing itself, or would the forces of ambition and resentment tear it apart? The answer would unfold in the years to come, but the quiet certainty that once defined Profaci's rule was gone. In its place stood uncertainty, restless and unresolved, signaling that the calm of the past had given way to a far more turbulent future. In the years that followed Joe Profaci's death, the organization he had built continued to change in ways that would have felt unfamiliar, even unsettling, to him. What had once been known simply as the Profaci family gradually took on a new identity, shaped by shifting leadership, public attention, and a very different understanding of power. This transformation was not immediate. It unfolded slowly, marked by internal struggles, external pressures, and a growing distance from the quiet, disciplined approach that had defined Profaci's reign. Joseph Magliocco's brief tenure as boss ended amid mounting instability and scrutiny. His inability to fully control the lingering conflicts within the family, combined with tension at the commission level, left the organization vulnerable. When Magliocco was forced out, the transition that followed signaled more than a change in leadership. It marked the beginning of a new era, one that would ultimately erase Profaci's name from the family itself. The appointment of Joseph Colombo as the new boss represented a decisive break from the past. Colombo was younger, more publicly visible, and far more willing to step into the spotlight. Where Profaci had relied on silence and tradition, Colombo embraced visibility and rhetoric. His leadership style reflected the changing times, as well as a growing confidence among mafia figures who believed they could operate more openly without consequence. The renaming of the family to the Colombo crime family was symbolic as much as practical. It signaled a shift away from the old-world lineage and toward a modernized identity rooted in individual prominence. Profaci's legacy, once central, began to fade from everyday reference. The structures he had put in place remained in some form, but their philosophical foundation was weakening. Under Colombo, the organization's relationship with the outside world changed dramatically. Colombo courted attention, speaking publicly about Italian-American rights and forming organizations that blurred the line between activism and criminal influence. These moves were unthinkable under Profaci's leadership. Profaci had believed that anonymity was protection. Colombo believed that visibility could be leveraged. This shift unsettled many older members who had thrived under Profaci's system. They watched with concern as the family attracted attention not only from the media, but from law enforcement. The calm routines of the past were replaced by unpredictability. Meetings carried a different energy, less restrained, more theatrical. Authority felt louder, but less secure. The younger generation, however, often embraced this new direction. They saw Colombo's approach as bold and progressive, a departure from what they considered outdated caution. For them, the Profaci era represented limitation. The Colombo era promised opportunity and recognition. This generational divide deepened, reshaping loyalties and expectations. As the family's identity evolved, so too did its internal dynamics. The emphasis on discipline gave way to personality-driven leadership. Decisions were increasingly influenced by public image and short-term advantage rather than long-term stability. Profaci's careful balance of obligation and restraint seemed distant, almost archaic, in this new environment. The commission, once a forum for quiet negotiation, became more strained as Colombo's actions drew unwanted attention. Profaci had valued his role on the commission as a stabilizing force. Colombo's approach tested that stability. Tensions rose, and trust among families weakened. The system Profaci had helped support was under pressure from within. Looking back, it became clear that the transformation from Profaci to Colombo was not simply about leadership change, but about a fundamental shift in values. Profaci's world had been defined by patience, routine, and invisibility. Colombo's world prioritized visibility, messaging, and confrontation. Each approach carried its own risks, but the contrast was stark. For those who remembered Profaci, the change was bittersweet. His name, once spoken with quiet respect, was now rarely mentioned. Replicating it would not be easy. His funeral reflected the duality of his life. To the public, it was the farewell of a respected businessman and community member. The church filled with mourners, the air heavy with incense and subdued emotion. Prayers were offered, hymns sung, and words of comfort spoken. Those who knew only his public persona saw nothing unusual, nothing to suggest the depth of influence he had wielded. Behind the scenes, however, the gathering carried additional meaning. Men who had operated under Profaci's authority stood side by side, their expressions controlled. Each gesture, each exchange of words, was measured. This was not only a moment of mourning, but a moment of transition. Alliances were silently assessed, intentions quietly inferred. As Profaci was laid to rest, the contrast between his end and the ends of so many others in his world was striking. He had not died violently. He had not been betrayed by his closest allies. He had not been cut down in his prime. Instead, he had reached old age, succumbing to illness after decades of power. In a profession where longevity was rare, this alone set him apart. Yet his peaceful death did not mean peace would follow. The conflicts that had simmered during his final years did not disappear with him. If anything, they intensified. Without Profaci's steady hand, divisions deepened. The structure he had built, once held together by his presence, began to strain under new pressures. In the days that followed, conversations turned increasingly toward succession. Names were mentioned, weighed, debated. Some believed continuity was essential, that the family should remain as close as possible to Profaci's vision. Others saw an opportunity for change, a chance to reshape the organization to suit a new generation. Profaci, had he been able to observe these discussions, would not have been surprised. He had anticipated them long before his death. What lingered most strongly in the wake of his passing was a sense of ambiguity. Yet his influence lingered beneath the surface. Many of the family's structures, its emphasis on hierarchy and tribute, were rooted in his system. Even as the organization evolved, it could not entirely escape the foundation he had laid. The irony of this transformation was difficult to ignore. Profaci had spent his life avoiding attention, only for his family to later become one of the most publicly visible crime organizations in America. The silence he had cultivated was replaced by noise, and with that noise came vulnerability. As time passed, the consequences of this shift became evident. Increased scrutiny led to arrests, internal violence, and instability. The sense of continuity Profaci had preserved was lost. Power changed hands more frequently, and leadership became more precarious. The calm endurance that had once defined the family gave way to cycles of disruption. Yet history rarely unfolds according to one man's design. The Colombo transformation reflected broader changes in society, law enforcement, and criminal culture. Profaci's methods had been suited to his time. The world that followed demanded different strategies, for better or worse. In this evolving landscape, Joe Profaci's legacy became quieter still. He was remembered by historians and insiders as a man of a different era, one whose success lay not in notoriety, but in longevity. The family that once bore his name no longer reflected his philosophy, but it carried traces of it nonetheless. As the Colombo crime family moved forward, its path diverged sharply from the one Profaci had charted. The shadows he once ruled from were illuminated, and the calm he maintained was replaced by turbulence. Whether this transformation represented progress or decline depended on perspective. What remained undeniable was that the era of Joe Profaci, defined by silence and control, had truly ended. In its place stood a louder, more volatile identity, one that would shape the family's future in unpredictable ways. And as that future unfolded, the contrast between the old and the new served as a reminder that in the world of organized crime, survival often depends not on who shouts the loudest, but on who understands when to remain unseen. As the Colombo crime family moved further away from its origins, comparisons between Joe Profaci and the men who came after him became inevitable. History tends to favor those who leave dramatic impressions, and in the mafia world, that often meant flashy violence, public bravado, and carefully cultivated notoriety. Against such figures, Profaci seemed almost invisible. Yet when viewed more closely, the contrast revealed something deeper about the nature of power itself. Profaci belonged to a generation that believed authority was most effective when it remained unseen. He did not cultivate an image, nor did he seek admiration or fear from outsiders. His strength came from predictability, from the sense that nothing happened within his sphere without his quiet approval. Later bosses, by contrast, often thrived on recognition. Their names became known not just within the underworld, but to the public at large. Newspapers, courtrooms, and television screens turned them into symbols, sometimes even celebrities. Men like Carlo Gambino and later John Gotti represented a different philosophy. Gambino, though still relatively discreet, expanded influence through calculated alliances and economic reach, operating on a scale Profaci never pursued. Gotti, on the other hand, embraced visibility outright. His tailored suits, confident demeanor, and open defiance of authority captured public imagination. Power, for Gotti, was something to be displayed. For Profaci, it was something to be protected. This difference shaped outcomes. Profaci ruled for decades and died in his bed, a rare fate in his profession. Gotti, despite his fame, spent his final years in prison. Gambino maintained influence longer, but even his legacy became entangled in public scrutiny. Profaci's name, meanwhile, faded quietly, remembered mostly by historians and those who understood the value of endurance over spectacle. The contrast extended beyond individual personalities to leadership styles. Profaci relied on routine and obligation. His authority was reinforced by structure rather than emotion. Meetings were calm, expectations clear. Later bosses often governed through charisma or fear, responding to challenges with force or public gestures. These methods could be effective in the short term, but they also created instability. Attention attracted investigation, and fear bred resentment. Profaci understood something many later leaders underestimated: visibility was a liability. Every public act narrowed one's options. Every bold move invited response. By remaining in the background, Profaci preserved flexibility. He could adapt quietly, shifting alliances or strategies without drawing notice. His decisions rarely forced immediate reactions, allowing him to control outcomes indirectly. This approach also shaped how Profaci was perceived within his own family. He was not adored, but he was respected. Respect, in his view, was more durable than popularity. Later bosses often inspired intense loyalty, but that loyalty could fracture quickly under pressure. Profaci's system, built on obligation and tradition, endured longer precisely because it did not depend on emotional attachment. In reflecting on these differences, it becomes clear that Profaci's apparent lack of drama was itself a form of mastery. He avoided the extremes that defined many mafia careers. He neither rose too quickly nor fell too dramatically. His life unfolded as a steady line rather than a series of peaks and crashes. Public memory, however, rarely rewards such subtlety. Stories gravitate toward the sensational. As a result, Profaci's name rarely appears alongside those of more infamous figures. This obscurity can be mistaken for insignificance, but in truth, it reflects the effectiveness of his approach. He left few traces because he intended to. The evolution of organized crime itself played a role in this shift. As law enforcement became more sophisticated and media coverage more intense, the environment changed. Profaci's methods were suited to an era when discretion offered protection. Later leaders operated in a world where visibility was harder to avoid, and some chose to embrace it instead. Whether this was adaptation or miscalculation remains a matter of debate. Looking back, Profaci's restraint appears almost radical. In a culture that rewarded boldness, he chose caution. In a profession defined by violence, he prioritized order. These choices did not make him legendary, but they made him durable. His survival was not accidental, it was the result of deliberate strategy. Even the internal conflicts he faced, such as the Gallo Rebellion, reflected this contrast. Profaci responded with patience and negotiation, avoiding unnecessary escalation. Later leaders might have acted decisively, even brutally. Such actions could have resolved the issue quickly, but at the cost of long-term stability. Profaci's approach prolonged conflict but preserved the organization's core, at least for a time. As the years passed and new generations took control, Profaci's method seemed increasingly out of step with the prevailing culture. Yet the consequences of abandoning those methods became apparent. Increased visibility led to greater scrutiny. Greater scrutiny led to arrests, internal violence, and fragmentation. The very things Profaci had worked to avoid became defining features of the new era. In this light, Profaci's legacy invites reconsideration. Was he weak, as some critics claimed, or was he simply playing a longer game? The evidence suggests the latter. He understood that power did not need to announce itself to be effective. In fact, announcement often marked the beginning of decline. As listeners reflect on these contrasts, the story of Joe Profaci takes on a different tone. It is not the tale of a man who failed to leave a mark, but of one who chose a mark so subtle that it nearly disappeared. His influence was felt most strongly in his absence, when the systems he built began to unravel. The comparison between Profaci and flashier dons ultimately reveals a paradox. The men remembered most vividly often lived the shortest or most troubled lives. The man remembered least endured the longest. In a world obsessed with reputation, Profaci invested in survival. As the night deepens and the city's noise fades, this lesson lingers quietly. Power, when exercised without spectacle, can endure unseen. Joe Profaci understood this instinctively. He did not need applause or fear to validate his authority. He needed only time. And time, for many years, was on his side. As the years passed and Joe Profaci's name receded further into the background of mafia history, debate quietly took its place. Among historians, former associates, and later generations of criminals, opinions about Profaci began to diverge. Some dismissed him as outdated, a relic of an old-world mindset that failed to adapt to changing times. Others viewed him as overly cautious, even weak, pointing to the internal rebellion he failed to fully suppress. Yet there were those who argued the opposite, that Profaci's restraint was not a flaw, but a deliberate and deeply calculated form of strength. Somewhere between these views lay the truth, shaped by perspective rather than myth. To critics, Profaci's insistence on tribute and rigid hierarchy appeared greedy. They argued that his demands strained his own family and fueled the resentment that later exploded into open conflict. From this angle, he seemed inflexible, unwilling to compromise even when circumstances clearly shifted. His refusal to modernize, they claimed, made rebellion inevitable. In a world that rewarded adaptability, Profaci appeared stubbornly anchored to tradition. Supporters, however, saw those same traits differently. To them, Profaci's tribute system was not exploitation, but structure. It provided predictable income, enforced discipline, and reinforced authority in an organization that might otherwise fragment. They pointed out that Profaci's family, despite its conflicts, survived longer under his leadership than it did under many who followed. Stability, they argued, rarely came without cost. The myth of Profaci as a weak leader often stemmed from comparisons rather than facts. Against flamboyant figures who dominated headlines and courtroom dramas, Profaci's quiet demeanor seemed unimpressive. He did not cultivate fear through spectacle. He did not demand loyalty through theatrical gestures. Instead, he relied on routine, obligation, and patience. To those accustomed to louder forms of power, this approach was easy to misinterpret. Reality, however, suggested something more nuanced. Profaci survived one of the most violent periods in mafia history without being killed or imprisoned. He navigated shifting alliances, internal dissent, and generational change while maintaining his position for decades. These outcomes were not accidental. They were the result of careful calculation and an understanding of human behavior that favored endurance over dominance. The internal rebellion led by Joe Gallo is often cited as evidence of Profaci's failure. Critics argue that a stronger leader would have crushed the dissent early, preventing years of instability. Yet such arguments overlook the risks involved. Aggressive suppression might have escalated violence, drawing attention from law enforcement and rival families. Profaci chose containment over confrontation, a strategy that prolonged tension but limited its reach. This choice reflects a broader truth about Profaci's leadership: he prioritized containment over victory. He was less concerned with appearing strong than with avoiding irreversible damage. In a world where one misstep could destroy everything, this caution was rational, even if unpopular. The myth of Profaci as a purely self-interested boss also fails to capture his broader motivations. While he certainly benefited from his position, his actions consistently favored order over excess. He did not expand recklessly. He did not chase new territories or dramatic gains. His ambitions were measured, focused on maintaining what he already controlled. This restraint frustrated those who wanted rapid advancement, but it preserved the organization's core. Another common misconception portrays Profaci as detached or indifferent to his family's struggles. In reality, he was deeply attentive, though not expressive. He monitored behavior, noted shifts in loyalty, and adjusted quietly. His leadership was observational rather than emotional. To some, this felt cold. To others, it felt reassuring. Much depended on expectations shaped by personality and generation. Profaci's reliance on tradition is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of his legacy. Tradition, for him, was not nostalgia. It was a system of tested practices that reduced uncertainty. In his view, abandoning tradition invited chaos. This belief shaped every decision he made, from tribute collection to dispute resolution. While this rigidity eventually clashed with changing attitudes, it also provided decades of stability. When examining Profaci's life objectively, it becomes clear that many criticisms arise from hindsight. It is easy to judge his choices knowing how history unfolded. Yet within the context of his time, those choices were often reasonable, even effective. The world Profaci navigated was less forgiving, less predictable, and far more violent than it might appear in retrospect. The reality of Joe Profaci lies somewhere between the extremes of myth. He was neither a visionary reformer nor a powerless relic. He was a careful administrator of power, deeply aware of its fragility. His leadership lacked romance, but it possessed durability. He governed not through inspiration, but through expectation. As newer generations looked back, the absence of Profaci's name from popular narratives reinforced misunderstandings. Without dramatic stories to anchor memory, his influence faded. Yet within the structures of organized crime, his approach left subtle marks. His emphasis on order and patience informed later strategies, even when his name was no longer invoked. In quiet moments of reflection, one might ask whether Profaci could have adapted more effectively, whether compromise might have prevented rebellion. These questions have no clear answers. What is clear is that Profaci operated according to principles that prioritized survival above all else. He accepted unpopularity if it meant longevity. He accepted obscurity if it meant control. The debate over Profaci's strength versus weakness ultimately reveals more about how power is perceived than about Profaci himself. Loud power is easily recognized. Quiet power is often overlooked. Profaci understood this distinction instinctively. He did not seek to be remembered. He sought to endure. As time continues to distance his story from the present, myth will inevitably simplify him. He will be labeled cautious, greedy, outdated, or forgotten. Yet beneath those labels lies a more complex reality, a man who mastered the art of restraint in a world that rewarded excess. In the end, Joe Profaci's true measure may not be found in dramatic victories or crushing defeats, but in the length of his reign and the manner of his death. He lived long, died quietly, and left behind an organization that struggled without him. That outcome alone challenges the myth of weakness. It suggests instead a form of wisdom rarely celebrated, but deeply consequential, the wisdom to rule without being seen, and to accept that true power does not need to announce itself to be real. Joe Profaci's life and legacy invite a complex examination, one that stretches far beyond the simplistic judgments often applied to figures in the criminal underworld. To some observers, he was an old-fashioned, even rigid leader, someone whose insistence on tradition and routine appeared inflexible or outdated. To others, he was cunning, patient, and remarkably adept at surviving in a world that devoured many of his peers. The debate over his strength or weakness is not merely academic, it speaks to the very nature of power in an environment where reputation, violence, loyalty, and discretion intertwine in ways that few outside it could fully grasp. Critics often describe Profaci as a man who relied too heavily on outdated methods, too slow to adapt to changing circumstances, and ultimately vulnerable to internal rebellion. They point to the tensions that arose with younger members of his family, especially the emergence of Joe Gallo, as evidence that his leadership style could not withstand evolving pressures. The rebellion and subsequent violence suggest, on the surface, that Profaci's methods were insufficient, that his patience was a liability rather than a strategic advantage. Critics see his calm demeanor and avoidance of spectacle as a form of passivity, a failure to assert dominance in a world that frequently rewarded boldness with survival or advancement. Yet these criticisms often overlook the broader context of his era and the subtlety of his strategy. Profaci operated in a time when visibility could be fatal. Unlike later figures who courted fame or public attention, he understood that silence was a form of protection. By remaining largely invisible, he avoided the scrutiny that had destroyed or imprisoned many other bosses. Whereas flamboyant leaders often fell quickly under the weight of law enforcement, public exposure, or internal betrayal, Profaci's discretion allowed him to maintain authority over decades. Survival, in his calculation, was the ultimate measure of success. The tribute system, often criticized as greedy or oppressive, illustrates this subtlety. To outsiders, the insistence on regular payments may appear exploitative, yet for Profaci it was both practical and symbolic. Tributes reinforced hierarchy, provided a steady financial base for the family's operations, and established a clear expectation of loyalty. The system was predictable, consistent, and, most importantly, enforceable without unnecessary violence. In this sense, the tributes were less a reflection of personal greed and more a tool for stability, ensuring that the organization functioned as a cohesive unit rather than a collection of independent actors. Internal dissent, such as the Gallo Rebellion, further complicates simplistic assessments of Profaci's leadership. While some see this conflict as evidence of weakness, a closer look reveals that Profaci responded with measured strategy rather than impulsive aggression. He avoided rash confrontations that might have escalated violence and drawn attention from law enforcement. He maintained the organization's structural integrity even while unrest simmered, using observation, negotiation, and calculated patience to manage the crisis. Many of the men who rose up against him had legitimate grievances by the standards of a younger generation less connected to Sicilian traditions. Profaci's choice to contain rather than immediately suppress rebellion reflects an understanding of risk and long-term consequences, prioritizing endurance over short-term displays of strength. Another dimension to consider is the generational divide that defined this period. Profaci's leadership was deeply rooted in Old World values, loyalty, obligation, hierarchy, and respect for tradition. He expected obedience, not flattery or spectacle, and he measured authority through consistency rather than charisma. Younger members, growing up fully in the urban landscape of New York, often had different expectations. They valued personal ambition, immediate reward, and visibility. The resulting friction is sometimes interpreted as evidence of Profaci's inadequacy, but it is equally valid to see it as a collision of cultural perspectives. Profaci's leadership was adapted to his own experience and context, it was not inherently flawed, but it was challenged by forces beyond his design. Faith and community involvement also shaped perceptions of Profaci. Unlike later figures whose public personas often glamorized violence, he maintained a carefully measured respectability. Regular church attendance, charitable contributions, and participation in community events reinforced an image of moral order, even as he exercised authority in the shadows. Critics might view this duality with suspicion, suggesting hypocrisy, yet it was a deliberate strategy for stability. Aligning public respectability with private power allowed Profaci to manage both social perception and internal authority, creating protective layers that bolstered longevity. The myth of Profaci as weak also fails when considering the longevity of his leadership. In a world where sudden deaths, assassinations, and arrests were common, he ruled his family for decades. He navigated the Castellamarese War, managed internal rebellions, and survived without the dramatic flair or notoriety that characterized so many other figures. His approach to power, quiet, methodical, and patient, allowed him to endure where others faltered. Viewed through this lens, what appears as weakness may instead be a profound and deliberate form of strength. History, of course, tends to favor drama. Figures like John Gotti or Carlo Gambino dominate popular narratives because their actions are visible, public, and sensational. Profaci, by contrast, left few traces in newspapers or court records. This relative invisibility has contributed to misinterpretation of his effectiveness. The absence of spectacle does not imply absence of authority, it reflects a strategic choice that prioritized survival and order over attention. In many ways, the very reason his name faded from popular memory is the same reason he survived as long as he did. Ultimately, the evaluation of Profaci's leadership invites reflection on the nature of power itself. Is strength defined by charisma, visibility, and bold action, or by endurance, discretion, and the careful management of risk? In the case of Profaci, the answer leans toward the latter. He demonstrated that influence need not be loud to be real, that authority could be exercised quietly and still command respect. He governed a complex network through expectation rather than fear, loyalty rather than intimidation, and long-term planning rather than impulsive action. The enduring lesson of Profaci's life is that power manifests in different forms. Where some leaders rely on spectacle to assert dominance, others rely on subtlety and patience. Profaci's story challenges the notion that the loudest or most visible leader is the most successful. Instead, it suggests that survival, order, and subtle influence can be equally, if not more, consequential. His life provides a counterpoint to the mythology of the flashy gangster, reminding observers that discretion, consistency, and strategic patience are often the quietest yet most enduring forms of strength. In reflecting on Profaci's legacy, one recognizes the complexity of assessing leadership in the underworld. His decisions, methods, and priorities cannot be understood solely through the lens of dramatic action or public recognition. They must be contextualized within a world defined by risk, uncertainty, and a constant threat of violence. Viewed in this light, Profaci emerges not as weak or indecisive, but as a careful and calculated strategist whose influence extended far beyond the visible markers of fame or notoriety. His true power lay in endurance, and his greatest achievement was that he navigated a lifetime of danger while leaving the world on his own terms, quietly, without fanfare, and remarkably intact. Joe Profaci's approach to power was as much psychological as it was practical, and understanding it requires a shift in perspective from conventional notions of leadership. Unlike the flamboyant figures often glorified in popular culture, Profaci relied on a careful, methodical control of minds and motivations rather than immediate displays of force. His authority was rooted in understanding human behavior, in shaping expectations, and in cultivating a network where obedience flowed naturally from perceived order and personal investment. In this way, he ruled not only with money, connections, and occasional coercion, but through an invisible architecture of influence that few outside his inner circle could fully grasp. Profaci's psychological strategy began with the fundamental understanding that fear, while effective in the short term, is inherently unstable. Leaders who rely solely on intimidation often provoke resentment, foster rebellion, or invite surveillance. Profaci observed these patterns repeatedly, both in his predecessors and contemporaries. He saw how overt violence could fracture relationships and destabilize structures built over decades. As a result, he chose restraint as his primary instrument, preferring subtle reinforcement of loyalty over dramatic displays of power. To him, true authority did not need to shout, it needed only to exist, quiet, inevitable, and respected. This mindset influenced how he managed his family internally. Profaci relied on expectations rather than threats, establishing rules and routines that created predictability. Tribute collection, assignments, and promotions were all conducted methodically, creating an environment where members knew their responsibilities and the consequences of failing to meet them. The predictability of his system fostered compliance, but it also engaged the mind. Members were constantly aware that every action, every choice, was being observed, assessed, and measured against standards that had long proven effective. The psychological effect was profound. Obedience became a habit, reinforced by consistency rather than coercion. Profaci's understanding of human motivation extended to his ability to blend obligation with opportunity. Loyalty was rewarded through tangible means, respect, protection, access to resources, but these rewards were never ostentatious. They were carefully calibrated to reinforce the hierarchy without creating dependence on spectacle or emotion. By structuring incentives this way, he created a sense of agency among his subordinates. They felt that they were participating in an ordered system where their actions mattered, yet the overarching control remained firmly with him. This subtle interplay between autonomy and oversight is a hallmark of his psychological mastery. Another crucial aspect of Profaci's strategy was his control of information. He understood that knowledge itself was a form of power. He maintained careful awareness of relationships, disputes, and ambitions within his family, often gleaning insights from minor interactions that others overlooked. By selectively sharing information and interpreting behavior, he could anticipate discontent before it escalated. Members were aware of the observation, which added an additional layer of self-regulation. This invisible pressure encouraged compliance without the need for overt threats, creating a psychological environment where discipline was self-enforced. Profaci also used perception to his advantage. His calm demeanor and understated presence suggested confidence and stability, even during periods of internal conflict. By projecting composure, he created the impression of control that went beyond actual actions. This projection influenced behavior. Subordinates adjusted their expectations, rivals hesitated, and outsiders underestimated his influence. In effect, he ruled not only through reality but through perception, understanding that the mind often interprets calm authority as unassailable power. Faith and tradition were integral components of this psychological framework. Profaci invoked cultural and religious norms to reinforce hierarchy and obligation. Appeals to loyalty, honor, and duty were framed not as personal demands but as extensions of long-standing values. These appeals resonated deeply, particularly with members raised in the Sicilian tradition. By linking obedience to moral and cultural imperatives, Profaci transformed compliance into a form of identity rather than mere obligation, embedding authority in the psyche rather than just in actions. Even in dealing with dissent, Profaci applied psychological insight. He did not react impulsively to challenges. Instead, he observed, waited, and allowed conflicts to reveal themselves gradually. By choosing when and how to intervene, he could shape outcomes while minimizing risk. The emergence of figures like Joe Gallo demonstrated the limits of this method, yet even then, Profaci's restraint forced opponents to act cautiously. He understood that impatience and visible aggression often created vulnerabilities. Measured response leveraged the psychology of risk and fear to maintain control without open confrontation. Profaci's system also relied on anticipation and scenario planning. He recognized that people respond predictably under stress, uncertainty, or opportunity. By controlling these variables, timing of meetings, distribution of information, allocation of responsibilities, he could influence behavior indirectly. Subordinates learned quickly that actions were noticed and evaluated, creating a feedback loop that reinforced the desired patterns of conduct. In this way, psychological control extended beyond immediate interactions to the very structure of daily life within the organization. The contrast between Profaci and later leaders is particularly instructive. Men like John Gotti or Carlo Gambino relied on charisma, public presence, or even fear to assert authority. Profaci, in contrast, understood that long-term stability often requires subtlety and invisibility. By shaping minds rather than simply issuing commands, he achieved a form of control that was resilient, adaptable, and less prone to disruption from external observation or internal rebellion. His psychological methods were slow-acting but enduring, a sharp departure from the more visible forms of leadership that would dominate the decades after his death. At the core of Profaci's approach was the principle that perception and expectation are as powerful as money, muscle, or influence. By carefully orchestrating the environment, controlling information, and reinforcing values, he created a system in which obedience felt natural and rebellion carried inherent risk. Authority was internalized by those he led, not enforced solely through external pressure. This nuanced approach allowed him to maintain control over decades of complex, often volatile relationships. Even as his health declined and external challenges mounted, Profaci continued to exercise this psychological mastery. His calm demeanor masked both vulnerability and calculation. He communicated minimally but deliberately. Subordinates learned that the absence of reaction did not indicate weakness, it indicated observation and potential consequence. This understanding shaped behavior far more effectively than force alone could have achieved. In reflecting on Profaci's life, it becomes clear that his success lay less in visible actions than in the quiet orchestration of influence. He understood human behavior at a fundamental level, leveraging obedience, expectation, and perception to maintain authority. His leadership was psychological first and practical second, a combination that allowed him to endure in a world defined by volatility, violence, and unpredictability. By the time Profaci passed away, his methods had been tested repeatedly, through wars, internal dissent, and generational change. His psychological approach had preserved the family structure longer than brute force could have, even if it could not prevent eventual fragmentation after his death. His legacy demonstrates that leadership in high-stakes environments is not measured solely by action or recognition, but by the ability to shape minds, influence decisions, and maintain stability when chaos is the natural alternative. Joe Profaci's mastery of psychological control was subtle, invisible, and enduring. It relied on patience, observation, and the careful calibration of human behavior. While less glamorous than the bold gestures and publicized conflicts of later mob figures, it was profoundly effective. In the quiet, deliberate management of expectations, loyalty, and perception, Profaci exemplified a form of power rarely recognized but deeply consequential, a power that endured through decades, survived violent eras, and allowed him to leave the world quietly, yet firmly, on his own terms. Even decades after Joe Profaci's death, his influence continued to echo through the mafia world, leaving subtle yet undeniable marks on the structure and operation of organized crime in New York. While he rarely attracted headlines or public attention, the systems and principles he put in place created a framework that shaped behavior long after he had passed. Profaci's emphasis on order, loyalty, and hierarchy was foundational, and even as his family transitioned into what became known as the Colombo crime family, traces of his leadership philosophy remained embedded in its DNA. Profaci understood that authority was not merely about power in the present, it was about creating continuity that could survive his absence. He built mechanisms of compliance and expectation that did not rely solely on his personal charisma or presence. Tribute collection, hierarchy, and structured operations reinforced loyalty through ritualized behavior, making it difficult for the organization to unravel completely even when leadership changed. Later bosses inherited these systems, sometimes adapting them, sometimes disregarding them, but the influence of Profaci's methods remained. One of the most enduring elements of Profaci's legacy was the principle of patient control. Unlike leaders who sought immediate recognition or domination, Profaci relied on long-term strategies, cultivating influence quietly and deliberately. This patience allowed him to survive wars, internal rebellion, and the constant pressures of a violent underworld. For subsequent generations, the lesson was clear: leadership could be exercised effectively without spectacle. His successors, whether they consciously realized it or not, inherited an organizational culture that valued stability and measured action. The transformation into the Colombo crime family marked a significant shift, yet the family's underlying structure still bore Profaci's imprint. While the name changed and leadership styles evolved, the basic principles of hierarchy, obligation, and loyalty persisted. Even as the family faced new challenges, external threats, law enforcement scrutiny, and internal disputes, the framework that Profaci had established provided a foundation upon which decisions could be made. The routines he implemented, the expectations he set, and the culture of obedience he fostered created a form of organizational memory that outlasted his tenure. Profaci's influence extended beyond mere operations into the psychological and cultural dimensions of the family. His insistence on respect for authority, combined with the careful calibration of reward and consequence, created a system in which members internalized rules rather than relying solely on external enforcement. This psychological conditioning persisted long after his death. Even under leaders who were more visible or flamboyant, members often operated according to norms that reflected Profaci's philosophy, highlighting the subtle, enduring nature of his power. The legacy of restraint also shaped the family's interactions with rival organizations. Profaci had demonstrated that survival often depended on discretion, negotiation, and calculated patience rather than open aggression. Subsequent leaders benefited from this precedent, understanding that measured engagement with allies and rivals alike could prevent unnecessary conflict. The example he set provided a template for balancing ambition with caution, an approach that tempered impulsive actions even when newer generations leaned toward boldness. Profaci's attention to loyalty and structure also influenced succession and internal governance. He cultivated a system in which authority was respected not because of fear alone, but because of ingrained norms and predictable routines. Later leaders inherited a family in which roles and expectations were clearly defined, allowing for smoother transitions and continuity, even amid challenges. The internal discipline he fostered, while occasionally challenged, provided a stabilizing influence long after his departure. Another aspect of Profaci's enduring influence was his understanding of perception and image. While he maintained a low public profile, he cultivated respectability and credibility within his community. His emphasis on public decency, religious observance, and community involvement created a layer of insulation and legitimacy. Subsequent leaders often struggled to replicate this subtle form of protection, and the contrast highlighted the advantages of Profaci's discretion. His approach demonstrated that influence could extend beyond direct control to shaping how the organization was perceived externally, reinforcing its resilience. Profaci's legacy is also evident in the way conflicts were approached in later decades. His preference for containment, negotiation, and observation over immediate confrontation influenced subsequent strategies for managing dissent. Internal rebellions, such as those faced under Colombo or during later Gallo faction disputes, were often handled with reference to the structures and expectations that Profaci had established. His methods had created patterns of behavior that could guide decision-making even when his personal authority was no longer present. Despite the evolution and eventual volatility of the Colombo family, Profaci's influence remained a quiet stabilizing force. Even as external pressures and generational changes introduced instability, the foundation he had built prevented complete disintegration. Structures of hierarchy, tribute, and loyalty provided continuity. Cultural norms reinforced internal cohesion. These enduring elements ensured that, although leadership and tactics changed, the family's core identity persisted in ways that reflected his vision. Historians and insiders alike often note that the full measure of Profaci's influence cannot be captured by anecdotes of dramatic events or sensationalized accounts. Unlike later bosses who became public figures through crime, arrest, or media attention, Profaci operated in silence. His power was invisible, yet it was no less effective. The endurance of his family, the survival of its structures, and the replication of his principles in subsequent generations serve as a testament to the subtlety and effectiveness of his approach. The lessons of Profaci's influence extend beyond his own family. His strategies demonstrate that authority can be both practical and psychological, that power can be exercised indirectly through expectation, routine, and perception. His approach offers a model for understanding how organizations, criminal or otherwise, can endure beyond the tenure of a single leader, and how influence can persist even when names fade from public memory. Ultimately, Profaci's lasting imprint is a story of quiet power. He created a system that endured long after his death, shaping the behavior, expectations, and decisions of those who followed. The Colombo crime family, despite changes in name, leadership, and approach, continued to reflect the principles he had established. His influence is measured not in notoriety, but in the subtle persistence of structure, loyalty, and order across decades. Even in a world defined by volatility and violence, Joe Profaci's quiet methods left an enduring mark, proving that the most effective forms of power are often those least visible. Joe Profaci's life concluded as quietly as it had been lived, leaving behind a legacy defined not by spectacle or notoriety, but by patience, endurance, and subtle influence. Unlike many of his contemporaries, his death did not mark the violent collapse of a criminal empire, but the gentle passing of a man whose careful planning had preserved his authority for decades. As the shadows he once commanded shifted to accommodate new leaders, it became clear that his greatest achievement was not the wealth he amassed or the control he exercised, but the resilience of the systems he had built. In the absence of flash and drama, the lasting power of his reign lay in the enduring structure, traditions, and expectations he instilled in the organization he led. Profaci's final years were marked by quiet reflection and the slow encroachment of illness. While the city around him moved with unrelenting energy, he remained a study in composure, observing, listening, and issuing guidance without losing his characteristic calm. Those who interacted with him during this time witnessed a man whose presence still commanded respect, whose authority was undiminished even as his body weakened. The contrast between his private struggle and the outwardly disciplined persona he maintained epitomized the careful balance that had defined his life, personal vulnerability tempered by unwavering control over his environment. With his passing in 1962, the family he had ruled entered a period of uncertainty. Leadership transitioned to Joseph Magliocco and, eventually, to Joseph Colombo, marking the beginning of a new era that would see the organization take on a more public and, at times, volatile character. Yet even amid these changes, Profaci's influence persisted. The structures he had put in place, hierarchies, tribute systems, and codes of conduct, remained intact, guiding behavior and decisions long after his absence. The rules he had instilled were internalized by those he led, ensuring continuity even as the human element shifted and evolved. The calm and discretion that had defined Profaci's leadership became a touchstone for reflection. In contrast to the flamboyant, headline-grabbing figures who followed, his life demonstrated the enduring efficacy of quiet authority. He had avoided the pitfalls of public exposure, celebrity, and impulsive aggression, preserving his longevity in a world where impulsivity often led to ruin. For students of organized crime, his career offers a lesson in the durability of invisible influence. The power that is not loudly proclaimed often survives longest. Even as the Colombo family adapted to new leadership styles, Profaci's philosophy continued to shape internal dynamics. His insistence on loyalty, obligation, and structure served as an unspoken framework within which successors operated. Generational shifts, ambitious subordinates, and external pressures could challenge the family, but the enduring rules and expectations he had established constrained behavior and guided decision-making. In many ways, Profaci's presence was felt most strongly in his absence, as a silent standard against which the conduct of others could be measured. Outside observers, historians, and casual audiences often overlook figures like Profaci precisely because their power was exercised quietly. The lack of flamboyant violence or public spectacle creates a perception of irrelevance, but this view misses the subtle mastery inherent in restraint. By relying on observation, psychological insight, and structured systems rather than immediate force, Profaci crafted a form of authority that proved remarkably resilient. His legacy demonstrates that influence is not always measured in headlines, arrests, or dramatic confrontations. It is often measured in the endurance of the structures, norms, and practices a leader leaves behind. The contrast between Profaci and later mafia figures underscores this point. Leaders like John Gotti became iconic not only because of their criminal activity but because of their public visibility, media presence, and willingness to court risk. Profaci, by contrast, remained deliberately invisible, cultivating respect and obedience without needing external validation. This invisibility was not passivity, it was strategic. It allowed him to maintain authority over decades of shifting alliances, rebellions, and wars, proving that survival and stability are as critical a measure of power as notoriety or fear. Profaci's life also invites reflection on the role of tradition and cultural continuity in leadership. His adherence to Sicilian values, loyalty, hierarchy, respect for elders, and obligation, shaped both the internal operations of his family and his interactions with external allies. These principles guided decision-making, informed behavioral expectations, and reinforced his authority. Even as new leaders modernized aspects of the organization, these traditional elements remained, reflecting the depth and durability of Profaci's influence. Ultimately, the story of Joe Profaci is one of endurance, strategy, and subtle mastery. He demonstrated that leadership does not require spectacle, that power can be exercised quietly, and that influence is most effective when it becomes embedded in systems, routines, and expectations. His life challenges simplistic notions of what it means to be a successful crime boss, showing that longevity, stability, and the ability to navigate complex social and organizational dynamics are as important as notoriety or aggression. As one reflects on Profaci's final legacy, the central lesson emerges clearly: true power often resides not in what is seen, but in what is sustained. The families he ruled, the systems he built, and the influence he exerted quietly ensured that his impact persisted long after his death. The calm, methodical approach that defined his life remains a testament to the effectiveness of patience, discretion, and foresight. In the end, Joe Profaci's story reminds us that the most lasting authority is often invisible, measured not by headlines or fear, but by the quiet endurance of the structures and principles left behind.